Largemouth bass may be the most popular sport fish in North America, but not a whole bunch of people pursue them with fly tackle. Well, 'tis the season to do it, and we're going to talk about just that on this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey guys, Chad LaChance here. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. Of course, brought to us, as always, by the fine folks at Sportsman's Warehouse. Visit them at sportsmans.com or any one of 140 plus stores nationwide. Quick point out, they will ship direct to the store for you as well. So if you find it online, they'll ship it to your local store and you can pick it up there. So check them out, sportsmans.com. So guys, here we are, very end of May. Memorial Day's come and gone, and I've spent the last couple days out doing some fly fishing. And it kind of came around because I was talking to a gentleman at Sportsman's Warehouse the other day who actually works there, and he was curious about fly fishing for bass. He fly fishes for trout. His favorite stream was blown out because of spring runoff, and so he wanted to know what my thoughts were in fly fishing for bass. And as always, I figure if one person will come out and ask it, maybe some other folks are curious about it, so I figured we'd talk about it on this episode. And if you're a fan of Fishful Thinker, first of all, thank you. If you've been following our content for the last 20 years, you know we don't do a lot of fly fishing. We do a fair bit of it, but not a ton. And the single biggest reason is the market. Realistically, a small percentage of people compared to conventional tackle fly fish. And I do this for a living. So I have to appeal in some ways to the fat part of the bell curve when it comes to anglers out there. And that doesn't just include my home state of Colorado. It includes all 50 states and 7 countries. So we kind of tailor our content to fit our audience, which hopefully makes sense to some of you out there, even though I live in an area where there's a lot of fly fishermen. And furthermore, I want to point out that I may not be known as a fly fisherman because that's kind of how I've positioned myself. But at the end of the day, I started fly fishing as soon as I moved to Colorado. I think by the time I was about 11 or 12, I was fly fishing, and I have pictures of me holding trout as a 13 years old, goofy looking teen standing knee deep in the river with fly tackle I got from my grandpa, and I've done it for a very long time. There was a gentleman by the name of Doug Ecker who worked at Anglers All way back in the day in Denver, who kind of took me under his wing and taught me a whole bunch of stuff. And there's probably 20 plus fly rods in my garage. So I do a lot of fly fishing, just not as much of it in our content. So the only reason I'm telling you that is so I'm not completely coming out of left field when you're listening to this going, well, geez, we didn't even know you could fly fish, and now he wants to tell us how to do it. Well, for the last couple of days, that's all I've done is fly fish for warm water fish, because the fish a day for the month of May thing has been rolling on. I've caught a lot of those here at my home lake because I haven't been traveling a tremendous amount. So I've been doing a lot of office stuff, video production, things like that. And so I've just been fishing my home lake a bunch. Well, if you're going to fish the same water a bunch, a good way to have more fun is to do the variety thing. So I've had a 3-weight in my hand the last couple of days chasing green sunfish and bluegills, and it's really fun. But I've caught several bass doing it as well, just smallmouth. And we've done whole TV shows several times on fly fishing for bass. So it's definitely a really fun thing, and this is the time of year to do it, and here's why. We're into May here in Colorado, and that means we've got bass either that are spawning, as in the case of like my home lake, or that will be coming off of spawn, as the case of all the ponds and most of the warmer reservoirs around town, and certainly east of us, those fish are done spawning, and they're still in the shallow water. They're still up, in fry guarding, so to speak, and things like that. I don't target bedding bass specifically, but I will definitely keep track of them when they're in shallow water and take advantage of that. And that fly rod is a very good tool for that. It's a surprisingly good tool. And I'm a big believer that whatever the right tool for the job is, what makes me happy is having, is catching fish with an artificial lure. And I don't care if it's presented on a fly rod or spinning rod or casting rod. An artificial lure that's presented is fun for me, and that's what I consider fly fishing. So when there's a ton of bass up shallow this time of year, well, that's a perfect time to get after them with a fly rod. And so that's a key thing. So I figured I'd talk about it, some details on it right here. and first and foremost, I want to point out that this is for smallmouth and largemouth. There's not a lot of differences in how I go about fishing for smallmouth versus largemouth with a fly rod. The difference only is where I fish them, not so much as to what I throw. So right off the bat, I want to clarify that because I've done probably both equal back and forth, smallmouth and largemouth. I might use a slightly bigger fly with largemouth, but otherwise it really comes down to where I'm fishing more than anything else. So that's only real nuance there. So the first couple things to keep in mind, I'm assuming that if you're listening to this, you already fly fish to some degree. And I also want to throw out that if you're a novice fly fisherman, this is an excellent way to go about advancing your fly fishing skills. Because I've said forever, if you're going to fly fish, if you're going to learn to fly fish, it's easier to learn in standing water. I've done other podcasts about that. Water that is sitting still means that everything happens on your time. If you're in a river and you cast your line out there, well, while you're getting your act together to cast again, that thing's drifting the whole time, blown downwind or downriver, and whatever. So on a lake, on the other hand, I can throw it out there and I can think about what happened. I can think about rod position or whatever the case might be for my casting, and it's just laying out there on the surface of the water, not a problem. And also, still water rewards longer casts. And for me, that's the most fun of fly fishing. I love to fly cast. I love the feel of about 60 feet of fly line in the air and how that feels loading and unloading on the fly rod, and that's what I really love about it. So stillwater fly fishing is actually one of my favorites. So for those two reasons, it's a great way to learn, and it's a really fun way to cast, and it rewards accurate casting. Those would make a good day out, good outing for me, and that's when I enjoy the fly rod. So important there. So when it comes to the fly tackle, you could be anywhere from about a 5 weight up to about an 8 or even a 9 weight. 5 weight's going to be a little bit light, but you can limp through it. It'll depend on the size of the flies you throw, as with anything else. 9 weight's a little heavy, but again, you can make it work. Really, a 6, 7, or 8 is probably ideal for fly fishing for bass. So that'll depend a little bit on where you're fly fishing, because that'll dictate the size of the flies, and that will dictate how big of a rod you need to put those through the air. Fly fishing, no different than spinning rod or a casting rod. If you need to throw a great big fly, you need a more powerful rod with a heavier line. And it's not really the size of the fish, it's the size of the fly. You'll be able to land any bass you've ever seen on a 5 weight if you've got some good control. So that's the key thing there. But might be that the bugs are a little too big. So again, fly rod anywhere in the 6, 7, or 8 range is probably ideal, with a 5 or a 9 being fringe, and you'll be fine. I also point out I did a whole CB show fly fishing for smallmouth with a 3 weight one time on a paddleboard, because you get the most fun, right? So I caught a whole bunch of say 11 to 15 inch smallmouth on that show on a 3 weight. So just throwing little small soft tackle wet flies. So very, very easy if you want to go that route as well. Point being, it doesn't have to be very specific equipment. The rod, in my opinion, you need to be able to throw some big bugs if you're going to be specialized. If you're a person that does have a couple of different fly rods, or you're purchasing one specifically for this, I'd probably get a 7 weight, because I can throw all the different bugs with it. That's the only thing it comes down to, is I can just throw a lot of different bugs. And we'll get into the specific bugs here momentarily, but that's the key. Furthermore, when it comes to the line, I'm basically 100% in on floating lines, because if I need to be deeper than that, in other words, I need a sinking line, then I don't really want to fly fish at that point. Again, because I like the idea of fly casting, and I don't enjoy casting a sink tip line. So a floating line is more fun to cast. So I like a weight forward fly line for this, in a floating deal, floating type of line, and I will keep it in good condition. I will keep that line lubed or cleaned, because you're going to typically, more than in a trout stream, you're going to have more yucky floating on the surface of the water. Yucky is a technical term, but you potentially will have more pollen and things like that in the water. Fly line will get gummy in a hurry, and you're trying to throw a big bug. So keep that in mind. The other thing is, if you're really getting specialized, a warm water line is better than a cold water line, because it will get less gummy, and it will cast a little bit more enjoyably. So again, if you're splitting hairs there, but a weight forward floating line is generally my choice for all of my bass fishing. Then from there, if I'm throwing something that's subsurface, okay, which again is something I do the least amount of for fly fishing, or very much subsurface anyway. Then I will use a fluorocarbon leader, and I'll talk more about leaders here in a second as well, but just to get you in the ballpark, I'll use a fluorocarbon leader to help pull my offering under the surface, and then whatever fly is then subsequently point loaded as well, or potentially a small split shot on the line slightly above the fly to help it get down, give it a kind of a chase look going on, but to where your fly looks like it's chasing your sinker, which I think can be a really good thing. But that's generally my setup for subsurface. And then I'll just swap. And there's a lot of scenarios where I'll just have a butt section on the rod, a significant butt section of maybe 20 pound even, like 20 pound monofilament. And then I'll taper it down to there to like maybe 15 pound monofilament with just a section. So in other words, maybe 3 or 4 feet of 20 pound, 3 or 4 feet of 15 pound. And then I'll tie some sort of a tippet, so to speak, on the end of that. I'm not generally buying tapered leaders for this. You can very much keep it simple if you want. Now, having said that, you can walk in Sportsman's Warehouse and get an OX tapered leader and just put it on there and be done. I just happen to have miles and miles and miles of fishing line in my shop that do a fine job if I knot them together and build myself a leader out. And again, this is not a fine-tuned presentation. We're not trying to throw a size 26 midge to something. We're going to have a big old bug, and as long as we can turn it over, we're doing pretty good as far as that goes. And then the tippet section from there is where I'll put the fluorocarbon on, or I'll continue to use monofilament and neck it down from there to, depending on how heavy the cover and how big the bug is, to maybe 10 pound, maybe 8 pound on the small end from there. So if you happen to do both flying conventional, you can use your regular line. It will work just fine. I use Trilene XT for the butt sections, the 2 stiff pieces, because just for what it's named, it's extra tough, it's stiff, and it's good for abrasion resistance. And so it makes a good butt section on a leader. And then I'll again put the tippet on from there, and that may be an XL, it may be fluorocarbon, would it be Trilene 100% fluorocarbon, but whatever. I'll tailor my leader for my fly. And so there's only 3 basic types of flies that I'll even throw for this. And bottom line, the first one and the most fun one is going to be some sort of a surface bug. And since I opened this with talking about bass being a post-spawn, and post-spawn bass love to feed up, a popper of some sort, a popping bug of some sort is really difficult to beat, and I really enjoy throwing them. And I will use the rod in a lot of cases to move the bug, a la Kelly Galloup, as opposed to stripping it, because I can get a more distinct pop on the fly if I use the rod to move the fly. And if you're a hardcore, classic fly angler, I'm speaking, gibberish to you right now. But the reality is, clamping the line against the handle of your fly rod with your rod hand and then popping the tip close down to the water will give you a whole bunch more crisp action on your bug on the surface or subsurface. And Kelly Galloup and I have had lots of talks about that years ago, not recently, but years ago we did. And he is a big fan of using the fly rod to move the bug, not the stripping hand. The stripping hand controls slack line in the same way that a reel controls slack line on a spinning rod, but the rod is where you impart the action. And so let's say I've got my 7-weight out and I've got a nice stiff leader on there, and it's maybe 9-10 feet long, and it's got maybe 8 feet long, and it's got a big old popping bug on the end of it. I'll make my throw and then pull the line nice and straight between me and the bug, and get the rod tip down by the water to where it's only 1 or 2 inches above the water, and then pop the rod tip to make the bug move. And then when I start getting behind, in other words, the rod's moving farther away to where I'm out of position, then I will just pull the rod tip back to the bug with my stripping hand, if that makes any sense. And that's how I will generally present the popper on a fly rod, and it works very, very well. Big poppers, I don't believe you can make a popper too big that you can throw on a fly rod, for bass anyway. You might, I've seen some big musky poppers or whatever, but the reality is you can get away with a really big fly, and then generally you'll get more bites. Keep in mind, a largemouth especially is named for the size of his mouth, and Berkley spent a lot of money to figure out that he would eat 1/3 of his body weight if given the chance. And so if you want to catch a 3-pound largemouth, a 4-inch long fly is not an issue at any level at all. So, a great big popping fly. The one thing I will caution you about, particularly with smallmouth, is the rubber legs. If you have too big of rubber legs on the fly, if you've got a fly that's got rubber legs sticking out to help move water, I have seen a whole bunch of scenarios, which we figured out by watching super slow-mo on film after we filmed it, that the bass comes to get the bug, but when he does so, his lips catch those legs and push the bug away from him. And so he'll end up missing because of the diameter of the legs. So I'll trim the legs down to where they're no more than about an inch across the whole fly, maybe a little bit more than that, or trim them off altogether because I don't want to miss fish with it. So a popping bug is one of my favorites. I typically will get them out of some sort of foam. I'm not a purist when it comes to this. I don't need perfectly spun and carved deer hair. I get it, that they're beautiful. There's great skill in doing it. Doesn't catch me any more fish. So foam popping bug of some sort, of foam bodied or cork bodied, something like that. Really good way to go about doing it. And very durable. You don't ever have to worry about it sinking. There are some scenarios where on any of my bugs, not just my surface poppers, where I will have a weed guard on them, which would be a monofilament weed guard that wraps around the hook shank and up to the eye. That will save you a little bit of frustration. It will also cost you a fish or two, unless you're getting heavy fish that are really taking the whole fly and letting them turn away with it to where you have a bunch of resistance before you set the hook. You'll miss a bunch of fish with that weed guard. So I will only use it when I need it. The rest of the time, if I'm throwing anywhere where I can, snag some debris, maybe 1 out of 10 casts, I'll skip the weed guard altogether. If I'm more like 1 out of 3 or 4 casts, okay, now I'm going to put the weed guard on. So there's a decision point there where I want to fly with or without a weed guard that is really important. Besides poppers, sometimes I'll throw sliders on really, really slick days. Basically, it's a popping bug with the head tied on backwards or glued on backwards. And a slider will work very well where it dives under the surface just a little bit when you pull it and then pops right back up to the surface. That can be an excellent choice for both large and smallmouth bass as well. And those are the two I'm going to gravitate to first. If I can get a surface popper picked up, I'm going to do that more often than not. From there, I'll go to unweighted flies, something like a deceiver, but that will go under the surface. And it's unweighted, so I'm basically wanting it to run, an inch to 6 inches under the surface. I might put a fluorocarbon leader on in that case to help it break the surface film and get just below the below the surface film of the water, and let that fluorocarbon, at least the tippet part of it, pull that under where it's a few inches under, and then typically those I'll move quickly. That's the bug I'll move the quickest, and I'll just keep popping that thing along with the rod tip, strip the line back to it, pop it along with the rod tip, strip the line back to it. Fantastic way to catch lots of bass, particularly if there's a more of a ripple on the water. A surface fly can be a little trickier to manipulate on the surface when the wind's blowing, but when it's calm, that's a great choice. If the wind is blowing, being just under the surface can be a good call. And for the record, in that scenario, I want a very bright colored bug as well, or black, something that's going to give a hard silhouette, because the fish can locate it a little easier. And in that scenario, I've even seen some flies with a small rattle tied to them, to use that as the weight that pulls the bug under the surface, and that can be great on windy days as well. Anytime you can add noise to your offering will help fish locate it on days where they're having a little harder time locating your bait, and so that can be a key thing there. And then the last even style I'll throw is going to be a straight up Clouser minnow of some sort, a custom Clouser minnow with heavy eyes on it. And they could be tungsten. I like the ones with tungsten on them. I like my Clousers tied with non buck hair. In other words, bucktail. I don't want the hollow deer hair. I want that fly to be heavy and not buoyant. So the more buoyant it is, the more lead I got to put on it, or the more heavy eyes I have to put on it, and therefore the harder it is to throw. So if I can make the use materials that aren't so buoyant, then I don't have to have as much weight to get that fly to sink, and it's more enjoyable to cast. And also I can cast it more accurately. So a Clouser minnow tied with synthetic materials and bead eyes can be great. But look, if you got a bunch of trout flies and you don't want to go buy some bass flies, fine. Get the biggest woolly bugger you got and throw it. I promise you, you'll catch some fish. Could be a green one, a black one, a brown one. It's going to be more about where you throw it than anything else. For that matter, it could be the old classic Bitch Creek nymph that's black and yellow. When I first started fly fishing for bass, that was the first bug I learned. I learned it from an old timer, and you still to this day will murder them. I can go on my home lake on Horsetooth right now, and I can go throw that thing up in corners all around the lake and just let it sink on its own, and it'll get bit nearly every cast. It might be a 6-incher or it might be a 16-incher, but a big nymph of some sort is definitely a possibility, particularly with the smallmouth bass. But I'm talking about a big nymph. We're not talking about some little nymph. Yes, you can catch some on a little nymph, but we're bass fishing here. Let's take advantage of the fact that they have big giant pie holes, and let's throw them something that they want to eat. So a great big nymph, a Hellgrammite-sized nymph, like I said, a big old Bitch Creek nymph, a woolly bugger, anything you might have in your arsenal, anything that will mimic a Pteronarcis, anything like that can be fine. And then the other one is any of your bubblegum worm flies, whatever you guys call those, you guys being the guys that use little rubber worms for fly fishing. I'm not that guy. I get that they're effective, but again, they'll work just fine, and you can throw those around smallmouth and you'll catch them as well. But if I'm being specialized, I'm always going to start in the top first, see if I can draw them to the surface. Then I'll take them just under the surface with the slider type deal, or the deceiver, I should say, and then I'll take it a step down from there and put the clouser on. And if I'm going to keep a bunch of action, then if I just want to dead stick it, when I'm going to throw it and just let the thing sink and see if they'll pick it up, which can be very, very good around post-spawn fish, then I'll throw the great big nymph of some sort, or a woolly bugger, or even just a woolly worm without the marabou on the end of it. So any of that will catch you fish. The key here is don't overthink it, right? It's more about where you throw it and how you throw it than specifically what you throw it. In this scenario, we are not matching anything. So you got to get that out of your head. Bass don't, it's almost never a pure match the hatch thing. They are very opportunistic feeders, and they'll feed on whatever looks edible. And if they're post-spawn and they're up in shallow water and something doesn't give them any negative cues, there's a good chance they're going to eat it because they just want to eat. They need to fatten back up. And like I said, he's named for the size of his mouth. So give him something worthwhile. When it comes to hook setting, I believe you need to wait a little bit longer with a bass than you do a trout. A bass is a suction feeder, and the fly doesn't represent a very big bite to him, even a big popper. Let them turn down with the bait and make sure that they turn away from you. Give them like a 1 to 2 second count before you set the hook, and then we want a strip set. We don't want a trout set. We don't want to clamp the line and lift on the rod. You're going to miss a lot of them that way. And so what we really want to see you is do a hard strip set, then clamp the line right there and determine if you've got him pinned or not. And then as soon as you know you've got him pinned, if you're fishing around any sort of cover, you need to get to horsing, get to pulling on that thing right away, because we don't have a little pansy tippet on the end of here. We've got plenty of tensile strength. But what we do have is a 9-foot fly rod that's very flexible. So we don't want the fish to move. The thing about bass, different than trout. If you're a guy that fishes for trout primarily and you're going bass fishing, the thing is he's going to turn and dive for the first piece of cover he's anywhere near. It could be a bush, branches, tree limbs, weeds, cattails, whatever it is. He's going to try to bury you in it immediately. So the whole shooting match with bass is typically won or lost in the first 3 or 4 seconds. If you get the hook set and the fish turned and coming to you, you're going to be better off. So that's the important thing. So big hard strip set, clamp the line, make sure you've got him tight. As soon as you know he's pinned good, start working on him. The thing about bass too is we don't want to fight him to exhaustion. We don't need to. You can lean on him with the tackle that you have. A 7-weight with, say, a 10-pound tippet on the end of it is a cannon compared to your midge rig or whatever. And so you'll be fine as far as that goes. Pull them back in and go from there. All in a perfect world, if I'm going to fly fish, I want my fish looking up, which means early and late in the day is going to be a preference if possible. Again, they're bass, they'll feed all the time, but or can be provoked into feeding because they're sitting in a nice shady spot and suddenly your popper comes over the top of them. They can be provoked into feeding pretty easy, but they're going to have active feeds at first and last light. So the perfect scenario here for you guys is to get off after work and run over to some pond that's near you and make, 75 fly casts and go home. That can be a really enjoyable way to unwind after a 9 to 5 job or something like that. And it's kind of an opportunity fishing thing. And also, in a lot of cases, if you fly fish, you've got to travel to get to a river. But if you happen to live anywhere along the Front Range of Colorado or anywhere in well, geez, a lot of places, I suppose, but if your river's a half an hour away, but the local bass pond is 5 minutes away, well, that's a no-brainer. Get out and get after it. And I'll also throw this out there. If all you have is a 4-weight, fine. Size your flies accordingly and understand that you're going to catch bass accordingly. So it's hard to catch a 5-pound bass on a little tiny fly, but it's doable. It's just hard to get them to bite it is the thing, to get them to locate it. So, but if that's what your tackle is, so be it. Don't listen to this podcast and say, well, I only have a 4-weight, and he said I need at least a 5 and maybe a 6. No, take your 4-weight, take the biggest flies you're comfortable throwing with your 4-weight, upsize your tip it a whole bunch, and then get to town. Go to town on them. It's not a problem. So that's going to be the biggest thing. It's more about getting out and making some casts with it. And then when it comes to the bugs, again, I don't get hung up on specific bugs. I generally like the larger the better, and poppers and all those things. Colors wise, it could be bright, could be bubblegum pink or chartreuse, or it could be bright red or black, or it could be super natural and looking very much like a bluegill or a shad or whatever you're trying to imitate. And incidentally, bluegill colors work really good around the post spawn, green sunfish colors, anything like that, because the bass know that those are fish that are coming to eat their fry, so they're already tuned into that as being a color range that they're looking at. But again, don't take that as I need to match something. You don't have to match anything. All you gotta do is be smarter than a fish with a pea-sized brain and a tennis ball-sized mouth. So that's all you gotta do. So don't outthink it. But at the end of the day, it's super fun. You can wade or not wade. You can do it from the bank. I know a bajillion ponds around town where I don't even have to leave the sidewalk. It's great casting practice. It's just generally fun way to go about fly fishing. Generally, if I'm going to go fly fish, I'll carry 10 flies with me, 12 flies with me to go bass fishing. Maybe a dozen, call it a dozen to be easy. And I'll carry enough leader material to replace my tippet with fluorocarbon or mono, depending on the scenario. And that's about it. I don't really look at a whole lot. The biggest thing to keep in mind is these are very much cover-oriented fish. So you need to throw close, if at all possible. And this is where the casting actually comes in. Close to whatever weed edges you can see, whatever rocks are in the water. With the case of smallmouth, I want to find them in typically around rock more than wood. Along the cattail edges, the closer you land to the edge, the more fish you're going to catch. Whatever it is. If there's a weed line out there, if you can parallel that weed line with a nice long throw, work your bug all the way down that weed line. Great way to go about doing it. Whatever it might be. Buoys, docks, fly casting around docks can be super fun. It's great accuracy practice as well. So anything floating, anything's mat, any dock, a little floating mat, whatever, a diving platform out in the lake, anything like that. There's bass potentially around. Just understand that throwing in open water is not typically your best bet, as you would find with trout, where you can just stand in one spot in a pond somewhere and catch trout cruising. Well, your bass aren't typically cruising very much. They're going to sit, particularly largemouth, they're going to sit in a lot of the time, and therefore it's up to you to be target oriented as an angler, and that will make a big difference. Also, this is the time for me, I like in a lot of cases to stretch out my throws, not because it makes me more effective, but because it's enjoyable and it's really good practice, particularly if you're going to go saltwater fishing or something like that. Maybe you're going to go bone fishing here in fall. Well, this would be a great time to get out and catch a whole bunch of bass on very similar equipment to what you're going to do with bonefish. And at that point, start throwing at all your targets, 60, 70 feet away. Don't throw at anything that's 10, 20, 30 feet away like I would advocate in a trout stream. In a trout stream, I'm going to advocate that you keep everything close. You have better control. But if standing water, you can stretch them out. So for me, an 80-foot cast with a big floating fly on the end of it is super fun and requires good skill to turn that bug over from a long ways, and it's fantastic practice for saltwater fishing. So Fly fishing for bass, a little bit specialized, super fun, doesn't require a lot of fancy techniques. And if you're a trout guy that only trout fishes primarily, you might find it to be really surprising. And I'll close with this last thing. Particularly if you're on the small end of the rod spectrum in terms of your weight of your fly rod, you might bring a couple of small, like a size 12 or even a 14, small soft tackle fly or some just super generic nymph, and catch panfish if you're not getting your bass to play. And like I said, I've been doing that for the last couple of days. I'm having an absolute ball. They're probably the smallest fish I'll catch the whole year, but they're super fun on the little fly rod. So fishing's supposed to be fun. This is a great way to do it. If the wind's blowing, do something else. That's the big thing. Don't fight the conditions. So appreciate you guys listening. If you want to join the conversation on social media at Fishful Thinker on Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok, I'd appreciate that very much. Hopefully you'll tune in to Altitude Sports and Entertainment and World Fishing Network, where we're airing 5 days a week on both of those right now with new content. And then the other thing I'll throw out there, please check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a labor of love, and we're putting lots of content up there. So thanks for listening. This has been Fishful Thinker, the podcast.